There is a bag of white sugar in almost every Australian kitchen, and for more than a century it carried 3 letters: CSR, the most familiar brand in the country. It is also the trail left by the most lawless corporation the nation ever produced. This one company chartered ships to carry kidnapped islanders to the cane. It worked indentured Indians on plantations they called hell. And it mined the blue asbestos that has killed more Australians than any industrial disaster in our history. More than 2,000 dead, still counting. And here is the part that should be impossible. It was never broken up. It was never brought down. It simply sold itself, twice, for billions, and left its name on your kitchen table as if none of it had happened. This is the story of how one company came to own the sweetness of a nation. Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories, the workers, the gates, the Australian made, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. Chapter 1. 1 shilling of every 3. To understand how a sugar company became the most powerful and the most ruthless corporation in the country, you have to go back to a failing business in colonial Sydney and a Danish immigrant who saw what nobody else could. His name was Edward Knox. He was born in 1819 in Helsingør, the Danish town the English call Elsinore, the very place Shakespeare set Hamlet. Of Scottish parentage, he came out to Sydney in 1840, a young merchant with a sharp eye and an even sharper patience, and he went to work in the colony's chaotic sugar trade. It was a graveyard of a business. Small refineries came and went, boiling raw sugar into an uneven, unreliable product and going broke one after another. Where other men saw failure everywhere they looked, Edward Knox saw an opening nobody else had the nerve to take. On the 1st of January 1855, out of the wreckage of a liquidated firm called the Australasian Sugar Company, taking over its refinery and its distillery, Knox founded the Colonial Sugar Refining Company. The capital was £150,000, an enormous sum for the time, and it was structured as a partnership of unlimited liability, meaning the men who owned it were personally on the hook for everything, and Knox himself held 1 shilling of every 3. A full third of the whole enterprise in the hands of one man from the very first day. It almost died in the cradle. A world sugar depression struck in 1857 and 1858, and the young company teetered on the edge of collapse. But Knox held his nerve where weaker men would have run, and the business did not merely survive, it thrived, paying a staggering 50% dividend as early as 1856. To grasp why that mattered, you have to remember what sugar was in the 19th century. It was not a garnish. It was cheap energy for a working population, preserved fruit, sweetened tea, the small daily luxury that made a hard life bearable, and demand for it only ever climbed. A man who could refine it reliably and sell it cheaply held something close to a license to print money if only he could see off his competition and survive the brutal swings in the world price. Most men could not. Knox could. He had the capital, he had the patience, and above all, he had a plan that none of his rivals had ever thought to attempt. He would be knighted before the end, Sir Edward Knox, and they would call him the King of Sugar. Late in his life, looking back on the empire he had made, he wrote to a friend with a strange, sticky modesty. He said he could only expect to leave behind, in his own words, a kind of smeary, sugary track. That track would eventually cover a continent and 3 countries beyond it. Because Edward Knox understood one thing his rivals never grasped. The money was not in growing sugar. It was not even in refining it. The real fortune and the real power lay in controlling every single step at once. Chapter 2. The Machine. What Edward Knox built, and what his son would perfect into something merciless, was not really a sugar company at all. It was a machine for swallowing an entire industry whole. Think for a moment about everything that has to happen for sugar to reach a kitchen table. The cane has to be grown in the tropics. It has to be cut and crushed in a mill to squeeze out the raw sugar. The raw sugar has to be shipped south and refined into the clean white product people actually buy. The waste left over, the molasses, can be distilled into rum and industrial alcohol, and then the finished sugar has to be transported and sold in every town in the country. Most companies did just one of those things and depended entirely on everybody else for the rest. Colonial Sugar decided to do all of them. It grew cane on its own estates. It owned the mills that crushed it. It ran the great refineries that whitened it. It distilled the waste into rum and alcohol and sold that too. It shipped and marketed the finished product itself. From the paddock to the pantry, CSR owned the chain, link by link, so that no rival, no grower, and no customer could ever get around it or do without it. And Knox went further still. He also ran the Commercial Banking Company of Sydney, which meant the man who controlled the nation's sugar sat right beside the money that financed it. This was power woven into power, an interlock of industry and finance decades ahead of its time. The genius, though, was in the detail, and it belonged above all to Knox's son. Edward William Knox took over the running of the company in 1880, and he would grip it tightly and personally for the next 50 years. E. W. Knox introduced what the company came to call chemical bookkeeping, measuring the sugar content and the yield at every single stage of the process with scientific precision, so that not a grain of sugar and not a penny of profit was ever wasted. He recruited the finest Scottish and German chemists in the world and set them loose on the problem of efficiency. Nothing escaped his attention, and absolutely nothing escaped the ledger. The physical heart of the whole thing was the great refinery at Pyrmont on Sydney Harbour, operating from 1878. It grew into the largest sugar refinery in the country, and in time into one of the biggest single industrial concentrations in all of Australia, second only to the steelworks of BHP itself. One vast site on the water, swallowing raw sugar by the shipload and turning out the clean white product for an entire continent. This is the mind that truly built the empire. Not a gambler and not a showman, but a cold optimizer of almost inhuman patience, a man who understood a simple and ruthless truth. If you control every step and you waste nothing at any of them, you do not merely beat your rivals on price. You make it impossible for them to exist at all. And by the turn of the century, the machine had done something no Australian company had ever managed. It had swallowed the sugar of 3 countries. Chapter 3. The Sweetest Monopoly on Earth. By any measure you care to choose, Colonial Sugar became one of the most dominant enterprises in the entire history of this country. In 1887, it was incorporated as a public company. And from that year until 1941, more than half a century, CSR was the largest public company in all of Australia. Not the largest sugar company, the largest company of any kind, full stop. It would take the rise of BHP and Australian Steel to finally overtake it, and even then only just. By 1906, Colonial Sugar had achieved the thing that almost no business in history ever truly achieves: a genuine, near-total monopoly, and not just at home. Across Australia, across New Zealand, and across Fiji as well, the sugar of 3 nations, controlled from a single head office in Sydney. The Fiji operation alone tells you the scale of it. By 1900, CSR had poured more than £2 million into the islands, and it was exporting roughly 88% of all of Fiji's sugar. Nearly 9 out of every 10 bags the colony produced. And at home in Australia, the grip only tightened with time. In 1923, the Queensland government signed an agreement that handed Colonial Sugar the exclusive right to refine all of the state's raw sugar. All of it. A monopoly written directly into law, and it would not be broken until 1989. And the monopoly did not stand on its own. It was deliberately propped up by the government itself. The whole industry sat inside the framework of the White Australia policy, which used a system of bounties and excise duties to reward sugar grown by white labour and to shut out cheaper foreign sugar. In 1915, the Commonwealth went further still and slapped an outright embargo on imported sugar, sealing the domestic market off from the rest of the world. So the largest and most powerful private company in the country was at the very same time one of the most heavily protected. The state was not merely failing to check Colonial Sugar. In a very real sense, the state was its partner, guarding the walls of the monopoly from the outside while CSR ran everything within them. Now, in fairness, and this genuinely matters, there was a real case to be made for the machine. For well over 100 years, Colonial Sugar delivered clean, reliable, cheap white sugar to ordinary Australian households, sugar that the generations before them could barely have afforded. It built the entire modern sugar industry of Queensland and much of the modern economy of Fiji very nearly from nothing. It employed thousands of people. It set up some of the earliest staff-provident funds in the country, and its chemists genuinely advanced the science of growing cane. It was, in its way, a real nation builder. That is the defence, and it is not a small one. Hold on to it, because it is about to collide with everything else, because a machine that big has to be fed. And the very first thing Colonial Sugar fed it was not cane at all. It was human beings. Chapter 4. Blackbirded. The Queensland cane fields of the 19th century ran on a system that Australia has spent the decades since trying very hard to forget. It had a name. They called it blackbirding. Between 1863 and 1904, an estimated 55 to 62,000 South Sea Islanders were brought to Australia to cut sugarcane, the overwhelming majority of them taken from the islands of what are now Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands. White Australians called them Kanakas. And the way a great many of them arrived in this country was, in the plainest possible terms, kidnapping. Ships sailed out to the islands and took men aboard by trickery, by false promises of wealth and short contracts, and sometimes by nothing more complicated than force, carrying them hundreds of miles across the ocean to labour in a foreign land they had never chosen. And Colonial Sugar was not a bystander to this. It was in it, directly. The historian Sally Young has documented that CESR chartered ships for the express purpose of, in the careful language of the time, recruiting labourers from these islands. Once they were in Queensland, the islanders worked in conditions close to outright slavery, for a tiny fraction of a white worker's wage, something on the order of £5 for an entire year of labour. They cut the cane that fed the mills, that fed the refineries, that produced the spotless white sugar that sat on the kitchen table in every respectable home in the country. Not one word of that story was ever printed on the bag. It is worth being precise about the scale of the human cost, because the numbers can slide right past you. Tens of thousands of people, over 4 decades, taken from their homes across the Western Pacific. Most were young men in the prime of their lives. Death rates in the early years ran appallingly high, in unfamiliar country, exposed to unfamiliar disease, and worked hard on poor food. This was not some fringe practice at the ragged edge of the sugar trade. For much of the 19th century, it was the labour foundation the entire Queensland industry was built upon. And Colonial Sugar, the giant sitting at the very top of that industry, was tied directly into it, chartering the vessels that carried the men in. The clean white product and the stolen labour were never two separate stories. They were the same story, the top and the bottom of the very same chain. The system was finally shut down, and it is important to be honest about why. It did not end out of mercy or conscience. It ended because of the White Australia policy. The Pacific Island Labourers Act of 1901 closed the trade down, and from 1906 the islanders were deported. Whole communities that had put down roots over decades uprooted a second time and shipped out. Men who had helped build an entire industry were simply removed from the country that had used them up. But the machine still needed labour that was cheap and that it could control completely. So when Australia slammed the door on the islanders, Colonial Sugar did something very simple and very cold. It moved the whole system offshore to Fiji, and to a word the workers there would come to translate as hell. Chapter 5. Narak. In Fiji, Colonial Sugar did not merely dominate the sugar industry. For the people who worked its plantations, CSR effectively was the government itself. They even had a word for it out in the sugar belt. Saka, the company, was the state. CSR moved into Fiji around 1880, and it built its plantations on a system of indentured labour imported all the way from British India. The workers were called girmitias, from the word girmit, which was their own pronunciation of the English word agreement, the labour contract that bound them for years at a time. And the numbers are genuinely staggering. Between 1879 and 1916, some 60,965 men, women and children left India for Fiji, packed onto 87 separate voyages across the Indian Ocean. 60,553 of them survived the journey to arrive, and by 1900, Colonial Sugar ran 3 mills and employed roughly 3/4 of every indentured labourer in the entire colony, about 4,500 people, driven out into the cane fields at dawn to work a day that ran at least 9 hours in the tropical heat. And the power the company held over these people was very nearly total. In the sugar districts, CSR set the wages, it controlled the housing, it ran the stores, and it effectively policed the daily lives of its indentured workers. There was nowhere else to go, and no one else to appeal to. This is what that word Saka truly meant. When your employer is also, in every practical sense, your landlord, your shopkeeper, your magistrate, and your government all at once, you are not really a free worker at all, whatever the contract on the paper happens to say. The women who came out under indenture were especially exposed, badly outnumbered by the men, and vulnerable in a system that offered them almost no protection at all. We do not have to guess what it was like on those plantations, because a witness left a record. A Methodist missionary named John Ware Burton, who was actually there and saw it with his own eyes, wrote in 1910 that the labourers themselves called the place narak. It is a word taken from Hindu scripture. It means hell. And Burton went further than that. He wrote that the difference between what he saw on Colonial Sugar's plantations and outright slavery was, in his words, merely in the name and the term of years. Read that again. A man of God, standing on CSR's Fiji plantations, said that the only real difference between what that company was doing and slavery itself was the paperwork and the length of the contract. Indenture was finally abolished after the First World War, and CSR eventually shifted to leasing its land out to tenant farmers instead. The company would not fully pull out of Fiji until the 1970s, when it sold up and the Fiji government formed its own sugar corporation to take over. But for all of it, for decade after decade, the neat white packet on the Australian kitchen table stayed absolutely, perfectly spotless. And Colonial Sugar was about to find a new mineral and with it, an entirely new way to kill. Chapter 6. The Blue Dust. In 1943, Colonial Sugar bought a set of mining leases in a remote gorge in the far north of Western Australia, at a place called Wittenoom. What the company dug out of the ground there would become, without any real competition, the worst industrial disaster in the history of this nation. The mineral was crocodolite. Blue asbestos. CSR mined it through a subsidiary it called Australian Blue Asbestos, and for the workers and their families it was a death sentence that took years, sometimes decades, to finally fall. Blue asbestos is the single most dangerous form of an already deadly material. Its fibres are needle fine, and once they are breathed into the lungs they lodge there forever. And then, 20 or 30 or 40 years later, they bloom into asbestosis and into mesothelioma, cruel cancers that slowly suffocate a person from the inside out. What made blue asbestos so uniquely cruel is that it gave no warning at the time. A man could work that mine for years and feel perfectly healthy, take his wage home, raise his children, and believe he had gotten away clean. The fibres did their work in total silence, invisible, decades deep in the lungs. There was no cough on the day that might have told him what was coming. The bill for Wittenoom was written the very moment the dust was breathed in, but it was not presented until the 1980s and 90s and beyond, long after the mine had closed and the town had emptied out. A whole generation was already condemned before the first of them even knew that they were sick. And here is the detail that turns a tragedy into something far darker. Colonial Sugar was warned, in writing, almost from the very beginning of the operation. In 1944, just 1 year in, a Western Australian mines inspector filed a report on what he called the dust menace at the site. In 1948, a doctor named Eric Saint wrote a warning, in words that now read like grim prophecy, that Wittenoom would in time produce the richest and most lethal crop of cases of asbestosis in the world's medical literature. And by 1958, a formal inspection found that around half of all the workers who had been at the mine for 3 years or more were already showing the visible signs of the disease in their lungs. Around 20,000 people passed through that town over the years it operated. Nearly 6,500 men and more than 400 women worked the mine and the mill directly, breathing that blue dust in day after day. And they carried it home. It came off the gorge on their clothes and their skin and their hair into their houses, onto their wives who washed those clothes, and onto the children who grew up playing in the tailings. Colonial Sugar had been told, in black and white, from the very first year of the operation, exactly what this dust was going to do to human lungs. And it kept mining that gorge for another 22 years. Chapter 7. What the War Built. To understand how a single company could do all of this and still hold the genuine affection of the nation, you have to understand what Colonial Sugar became during the Second World War. When the war reached the Pacific, sugar itself turned into a strategic commodity overnight. And from July 1942, it was rationed, £2 per adult every fortnight, controlled directly by the government's Rationing Commission. And CSR, with its vast industrial muscle and its army of engineers and chemists, threw itself into the war effort. At Cowra, in central New South Wales, the company built and ran an enormous distillery for the Commonwealth Government, opened in December 1943, designed to turn well over 1 million bushels of wheat into more than 3 million gallons a year of power alcohol, the ethanol that was blended into fuel to stretch the nation's desperately scarce petrol. At its Pyrmont works in Sydney, CSR's engineers set up a shell shop and a gun shop, and they even produced the pattern for a single-piece hull for an Australian-built tank. The men who refined the nation's sugar were, for a few years, helping directly to arm it. The war reached CSR's empire in other ways too. In Fiji, the Pacific War brought a genuine fear of Japanese invasion, and the disruption and inflation of those years drove the colony's cane growers to strike against the company in 1943, a bitter dispute that Colonial Sugar ultimately won. Sugar, alcohol, munitions, building materials, all of it under one corporate roof, in a nation fighting for its very survival. CSR was no longer simply a business. It had become part of the national infrastructure, woven so deeply into the economy that the very idea of it as a villain would have struck most Australians of the day as absurd. And the war did one other thing, something that would matter more than anyone realised at the time. It pushed Colonial Sugar to diversify. From 1942 onward, the company that had been built entirely on sugar began moving aggressively into chemicals and into building materials, laying the first foundations of the sprawling industrial conglomerate it would one day become, the very thing that would eventually let it outlive sugar altogether and walk away from all of it. It is worth being clear and scrupulously fair about Wittenoom. In this light, because the easy, angry version of the story is actually wrong. Colonial Sugar did not buy that asbestos mine in order to win the war. The historical record is clear that CSR bought Wittenoom because crucidolite was a valuable strategic mineral with strong export demand, and because the company was making a cold, shrewd bet on the enormous building boom that everyone knew would follow the war. A boom that would be hungry for cheap asbestos cement in millions of new homes. It was a business decision calmly made about the future, which, if anything, only makes it worse. Because by the end of the war, Colonial Sugar had made itself genuinely, patriotically useful to the country. And that only made the one question nobody could ever force it to answer that much harder to bear. Chapter 8. The Company That Would Not Answer. Long before the asbestos, long before Wittenoom was even a name on a map, the nation had already tried, once, to look inside Colonial Sugar, and the company had simply refused to let it. In 1911 and 1912, the Commonwealth Government ran a full Royal Commission into the sugar industry, prompted in large part by the way CSR had been quietly swallowing its remaining competitors. What the commissioners found was damning, in its own dry and careful way. Colonial Sugar, they concluded, had no effective competition anywhere in the market, and it simply fixed the price of raw sugar. In plain terms, the monopoly was real, it was total, and it set the terms of trade for everybody else in the country. This was the pattern of the whole enterprise laid bare in an official government document. Colonial Sugar bought up its rivals until there were none left to buy, and then, with no one able to challenge it, it simply named the price that the growers received and the price that the country paid. The commissioners could see it plainly enough. What they could not do was compel the company to reveal exactly how the machine worked on the inside, because the man who ran it would not permit it. And that refusal was not the nervous silence of a man with some small thing to hide. It was the calculated confidence of a man who knew precisely how much power he held, and exactly how little the government could actually do about it. But the genuinely extraordinary thing was what happened when that Royal Commission asked Colonial Sugar to explain itself. Edward William Knox, the autocrat at the absolute peak of his power, simply refused. He would not answer the Commission's questions about the company's costs. He would not hand over the company's books. And when the Commission pressed him, Colonial Sugar did something almost unheard of, then or now. It took the Commonwealth of Australia itself to court, challenging the very legal power of a Royal Commission to compel it to testify. And it won. The highest court in the entire British Empire ultimately sided with the limits on that power and against the government. Sit with what that actually means for a moment. A private company faced down a national inquiry, flatly refused to open its books to the elected government of the country, and then beat that government in court. This was not a business that feared the law. This was a business that believed, with a great deal of hard evidence behind it, that it simply stood above the law. And Edward William Knox was no shadowy fringe figure while he did all this. He was so respected in the very corridors of imperial power that he personally advised Winston Churchill, then running Britain's colonial office, on how to wind up the system of Indian indentured labour in Fiji. It would take another 70 years and a courtroom slowly filling with dying men before anyone on earth could force Colonial Sugar to answer for anything at all. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. That came too late. The mine at Wittenoom finally closed on the last day of 1966. But the dying did not stop when the mine did. In truth, it was only just beginning. Because asbestos disease is horribly patient. It can take 20, 30, even 40 years for the fibres. a man breathed in during the 1950s and 60s, to finally become the tumour that kills him. And so, decade after decade, quietly and steadily, the men who had worked that gorge began to sicken and die. And it was not only the miners. The wives who had shaken out and washed their husbands' dusty work clothes began to die of it, and even people who had done nothing more than grow up as children in that town, breathing its air, began to die of it too. The death toll from Wittenoom has now passed 2,000 people, and it is still climbing to this very day. When the victims and their families finally came looking for justice, Colonial Sugar fought them with everything it had, and its strategy was cold and deliberate. First, it hid behind the corporate veil of its subsidiary, arguing that the parent company could not be held responsible for what its subsidiary had done. Then it denied that it had ever even seen those early warning documents, and in the very end, it went so far as to deny that asbestos was truly what had killed its own workers at all. But the cases came anyway. A man named Klaus Rabenholt won a judgment in which the company was found to have been recklessly indifferent to human life and was hit with exemplary damages as punishment. And then, in 1988, in the case of two dying men named Peter Hayes and Tim Barrow, a court finally pierced that corporate veil and found Colonial Sugar itself directly and personally negligent. Tim Barrow was awarded $216,000. He was dead within 2 months of the verdict. Peter Hayes died during the trial itself, before it had even reached its end. These were not abstract legal victories. They were verdicts delivered to men in the last weeks of their lives, or to the widows and the children they left behind. And for every named case that reached a courtroom and made the newspapers, there were hundreds of others who sickened and died quietly, in mining towns and suburbs right across the country, without ever seeing a single cent or hearing one word of apology. The compensation, when it finally came at all, came as a trickle against a flood, decades after the decisions that doomed these people had been made in a boardroom by men who were, by then, long dead themselves and safely beyond the reach of any justice. One point has to be made very clearly here, because people confuse it constantly. This asbestos story belongs to CSR and to CSR alone. It is not the James Hardie scandal. The famous campaigner Bernie Banton fought James Hardie, a completely different company, over a completely different asbestos disaster. Colonial Sugar's dead at Wittenoom are a separate crime, with a separate name on it. And here is the part that should be genuinely impossible to believe. Through every single bit of this, through the Commission and the courts and the 2,000 dead, Colonial Sugar never fell. It got richer. Chapter 10. The Name on the Shelf. We began this story with a comparison to the greatest monopoly in all of history, Standard Oil. And this is exactly where that comparison breaks apart, in a way that should trouble anyone who still believes in justice. Standard Oil was broken up. In 1911, the American government took the single most powerful company on the face of the earth and shattered it into 34 separate pieces. Colonial Sugar, for everything it did, was never broken up at all, nothing even close to it. It simply, calmly walked away. By the late 20th century, CSR was no longer really a sugar company in any case. That wartime diversification had grown, over the decades, into a sprawling conglomerate of building materials, chemicals and aluminium, and sugar itself had shrunk to just a fraction of the whole business. So the company began, coolly and very profitably, to sell itself off in pieces. In 2010, it sold its entire sugar division, the beating heart of the enterprise, the original reason the company had ever existed, to Wilmar, a giant agribusiness multinational based in Singapore, for an enterprise value of $1.75 billion. The sweetness of Australia, sold clean offshore. Then, in 2024, the The rest of the company, the building products business that still proudly carried the CSR name, was bought outright by the French industrial giant Saint-Gobain for around $4.5 billion. It is the same shape the world has watched play out with the great monopolies of our own age. The names change and the product changes, but the pattern does not. A company grows so vast and so vertically complete that it controls not merely a market, but the very ground that market stands on. And by the time anyone thinks to stop it, it has already won, already moved on, and already cashed out. Go looking for the old empire today, and there is almost nothing left to find. The great Pyrmont Refinery in Sydney, once the largest sugar refinery in the entire country, was closed and demolished in the late 1990s, and the site is covered in apartments now. Almost the only thing that survives of the whole operation is a single weathercock, rescued from the rubble and re-erected. And one last thing must be set straight, because it confuses people endlessly. The CSR sugar, still sitting on the supermarket shelf today, is no longer owned by the old company at all. That famous brand belongs to the Wilmar Group now. The corporation still called CSR is French-owned Building Products. The famous sugar and the famous company have become two entirely different owners, quietly sharing one very old name. So here is where all of it leaves us. The most lawless corporation this country ever produced chartered ships to carry kidnapped men across the sea. It worked human beings on plantations they called hell. It was warned, in writing in its very first year, that its blue dust would kill, and it mined that dust for 22 more years, and more than 2,000 Australians are dead today because of it. And it was never broken up. It was never brought to heel. It was never once truly made to pay. It simply sold itself, twice, for billions of dollars, and handed the pieces to Singapore and to France. The company is foreign now. The sugar is foreign now. The dead are still Australian. And the name still sits there on a bag of the cheapest, most ordinary thing in the house. 3 plain white letters that tell you absolutely nothing at all about what they cost.